Greetings, Planet Mitch here from lightrumors.co, a brand new website covering the Light L16 multi-sensor, multi-lens, computational imaging camera. If you visited our site, you'll see that we've got quite a bit of news because yesterday, Light released a whole lot of information about the new camera and shipping dates and photos. What we're going to do is go through those photos and share with you a little bit about what I've learned from them. The good and the bad and the ugly. But there's no ugly. There's just good and a little bit of bad. I also have started a Light L16 Flickr group if you want to jump over to there to see that and join us when people start uploading photos from their L16s. They'll all hopefully put them in this group. I also encourage you to come over and join our Facebook group. It's a public group and anyone can join. All about the Light L16. We're going to show photos, we're going to discuss news, and whatever else you want to talk about. You can see both of those links on our webpage over in the sidebar. And if you want to join our mailing list, you can do that with just one click with Facebook by clicking here. Join our Facebook group or the Flickr group, and you can see the last 16 images added to the Flickr group. Also, please, because we're brand new, I do encourage you to share with your social media with Facebook, Twitter, Google+, and whatever, because that will help us be found by those people who are excited about the Light L16. I want to show you some of these photos in Lightroom because that gives us the best opportunity to examine these. This particular one, the first one, is from their earlier release. This is not one of the new ones from Cuba that was released before, but it gives us some interesting information. We might be able to see a little bit of the progress from their beginning. So this was, I think, released last fall. I'm sorry I didn't look up the date. It drives me crazy because the horizon isn't level. But this is actually one of the bigger ones that they've released. If you look up here in the upper right left corner, I can't do my directions right, I'm sorry. This one is 5163 by 3872, so that's pretty large. Interesting things about an image like this is that it has lots of brights. Up in the upper right corner, you see lots of highlights, lots of shadows. In this rock, for example, there is a pure white section, which is the reflection, and I don't know if anybody's ever going to be able to solve that problem with a traditional sensor. But you can see lots of detail in the shadow areas, like in this rock in the lower right corner and in the rocks back here that are in shadow. So this is called high dynamic range. There's a little bit of information here in the darks of these rocks as well. Let me turn off that so you can see it a little bit better. If I use the Lightroom controls, if I darken the blacks down here, this is what you might typically see in terms of shadows on a traditional camera. So we're seeing some recovery of the shadows, and again, this is an earlier image from last year and they have improved on the sensor since then. If we look at this upper corner, you can see there is some noise in areas like the rocks here. You see into the shadows, but there's also some noise, and I think they've done some good reduction on that. The typical person isn't probably going to notice this. The pixel peepers like me will notice this noise and complain about it or enjoy it. Depends upon your flavor. You also notice that along the tops here, there isn't any discernible. There might be just a hair of a green tint. This is often an area that is a problem for lens manufacturers where there is dark elements against a very bright background, and you might see what's called purple fringing or chromatic aberration. We're going to look at some of the newer images as well, but I'm not seeing a whole lot of chromatic aberration here. It's typically purple or blue. There may just be a hair of green here. But again, we're looking at an expanded view or blown up view. One of the other things we want to do is look at how much we can manipulate these. Now, right now, these are JPEGs, and JPEGs don't modify as much as raw images do. If we play with some of the filters, for example, in Lightroom, one of my favorite ones is this one called Color Miracle, and I don't remember where I got it. But it kind of does even more HDR to images. And you can see in these areas that we've pulled out a whole lot more detail in the shadow areas. Now, that's not necessarily appealing to everyone, but if you look at these areas like this rock down here that before, let me show you the before, was pretty dark and dismal, you certainly can still pull out colors and dark areas. Obviously, this brings out a lot of the noise and maybe even some of the fringing that we were talking about before. Let's look up at the top. So we're again highlighting some noise here because of this, and we're definitely seeing some more greens and stuff up here in the fringe. But that's okay. I mean, again, most people aren't going to notice those things if I zoom back out and turn off my little mouse. That's kind of an appealing image. It shows skies. We see a little bit of cloud. We see into the shadows. Again, this is the before. I'm sorry, this is the after, and this is the before. So you see that this can be manipulated quite a bit. You can pull down the highlights. If I make the blacks even darker, you know, there's a lot of appeal. If I really stretch it out and zoom in, all kinds of things start happening. But again, this is a JPEG, and remember, this is also an older version of the light, L16. This is one of the new images that came from their Cuba shoot with the latest iteration of the software, probably hardware as well. Notice that it's smaller than the ones that we got before, and all of the ones that we're going to look at from Cuba are smaller, starting with the 3000 width to them. So that's a bit of a disappointment. We're not seeing the full detailed image, but we do get some good insight into where this is going. We obviously are seeing as well that they had the flash turned on. We don't get any of that details yet from the image because the EXIF, we don't get any of that information yet from the cameras. They've stripped all that off. We can tell that the flash was on based on the reflection in his eye here and the highlights on his face that are in shadow of the sun. So we did get some fill from the flash on the dark side of his skin, on the dark side of his face, the non-sun. So that's where some of the light is coming from in this particular image. This next image shows you a bit more of the surrounding area. So again, this is the same camera, no lens change, although they have zoomed out, I assume, on the back of the screen with the pinch or zoom, showing more of the area. We do see a lot of the highlights here seem to be a little blown out, in my opinion. Probably we can change that in terms of at the time of the exposure. This might be a little bit, if you look at the histogram, it's a little bit pushed to the right. So let's drag it over a little bit and see what happens. Let's bring this down in exposure just a little bit. And you still see some of the highlights are pretty bright there on his chest. Let's just zoom in and look at it in detail and see if we can pull some of those down a little bit. So we can, using Lightroom, pull those highlights down. And that has changed the whole image, obviously. I'm not doing it on a particular location. And so, again, we can do all kinds of things like throw our Color Miracle filter on there, which is a little too much for me. So I'm going to undo that. But this is the original. I'm sorry, this is the original image, and this is after we've tweaked it a little bit. One of the difficulties in taking photos like this, and we'll see it when we get to the beach as well, is getting any kind of tones in the sky when you're exposing for flesh, especially in bright sun, and especially in situations where you're trying to get the shadows to come through as well. So typically skies are way overexposed in order to make somebody appear human or normal. I suspect that we can probably surmise that the flash was on again here. We don't see it specifically in the eyes. Might see it a hair on his chin. So I think the flash was on here to bring out the side of him that is in shadow. And again, he's a good distance away. We don't know exactly how far away, but maybe 6-8 feet. So the flash has provided some fill, which is good. Hopefully we don't have to have that on. We can select whether we want that on or not. But overall, we've got a nice blur in the background. We've got the fish and his body in focus. So we have a narrow depth of field on this. And we also have the highlights. The sky is really coming through. If I turn on the luminance filter, I can probably bring the sky down even more, although that typically will do weird things. It kind of puts halos around people if you do too much. And if you look at the trees over here, that's obviously something that I would not publish if I were publishing this photo, but it does let you see that you can still pull down colors and stuff even in the JPEG. So here's the original, and throwing way dark blues in there. That's just me playing. But it does give us an indication of what we can or can't do with the JPEGs. So at the beach, if you've ever been to the beach, you have really bright whites, lots of bright subject. This is obviously taken during midday sun. But yet we still, as you see, we see clouds, we see blue sky, and most importantly, we see her face, even though the sun is directly over her head, and therefore this typically would be pretty dark shadows. And if you were using a DSLR, you would have to set your exposure to try to capture her face and her skin at the proper tones, and your sky would be blown out. So we're seeing quite a good bit of high dynamic range here in the new light L16, which is kind of cool. Of course, we can play with filters and bring out colors, make them really wild. Let's see what happens if I bring down the luminance in the sky. Obviously, if I bring it too much, we're going to get that fringing or the halos around her head. Again, we're seeing the really craziness going on in the sky. We're seeing the real craziness and halo around her head. And notice we see something really interesting if we move this over a little bit. Crazy people who really look in pixels like to see what happens if you really do weird things. Bring it down a bit. And you can see that there are some lines appearing here in the sky. It's not bad. Not saying it's a horrible thing for this camera. It would make it difficult to go this crazy with the way I have tried to accentuate the blues. But if I bring that back a bit, if I come back up a little bit, you will see that Lightroom will handle that pretty well. If I zoom in You see that most of that disappears. And you'll see this on other cameras as well. Going back to the original image, we do again see that there is a good bit of depth of field. And this hand is out of focus. Her face is in focus. And then this side of her body is out of focus. So we have a fairly narrow range of depth of field. In the next Cuba image, we see this gentleman playing his guitar on the streets of Cuba. Dead middle of the day. Look at the shadow down here. He is like noon. It is midday. This is one of the toughest times to take photos, especially with somebody who's wearing a hat. So we notice that we're seeing quite a bit of light underneath here. I suspect that they turned the flash on again based on the highlights in his eyes, the catch lights. I suspect they used the flash on this, which is okay because that exposes underneath the hat a bit and the upper part of his face, which is what you want, right? You want people to be able to see his eyes and his face. I have a photo of one of my daughters from a long, long time ago who was wearing a hat, and it was a devil trying to pull any detail out from underneath the hat. So this is kind of impressive. I'm looking forward to getting my hands on one. In terms of negatives, if we look at his shoes, I think his white shoes are totally blown out. If we look at the histogram over here, then you can see there's a big spike right here in the upper whites. But again, I think that if we want to play with these images, let me throw this color miracle on it because it's always fun to see what happens. Looks a lot more HDR-ish. And if I pull the highlights all the way down and then look at his shoes, and then look at his shoes, we get a little bit more detail, but most of the detail is just gone. And that's okay. Nobody cares about his shoes, right? Looking at the original image again, notice that there is some detail in the sky. Obviously, they weren't clouds that day, at least in this location. And so it's blue, but that's good because at least there's some blue there. If I go back to the original and see if I can pull down some of that blue, I bet I can. Notice there's some fringing that appears up there. Notice by pulling that down way, way far, I'm getting some fringing on there. But that's okay, because I would never really try to do that to this image. But we do have flexibility, which is the awesome point. We also have these two images of this gentleman out in the field doing some work. Important aspects here are the depth of field that we're looking at. So here on his hand, this is obviously out of focus, and then you can see that focus happens on his shoulder and then disappears out the back. So it gives us an indication of how much depth of field there is. Now they've given more depth of field. I suspect this is something like an f4 maybe kind of aspect, because a good bit of his face is in focus and almost the front of his hat. I suspect that they did not turn the flash on because I think we might see in his eyes a catch light. But and I think his neck would be more bright on this side, which would also probably blow out his hand even more. So we're getting quite a bit of dynamic range in here. If we throw our color miracle on there, we get quite a bit of craziness going on. This is the other image from the same gentleman. We do have, again, the very narrow depth of field. Background is very blurry and very good blurry. It's not wonky in any way. If we look at that, we're also not seeing noise. I haven't talked about noise since that first image. Looking in the shadow areas, I'm not seeing a whole lot of noise. which is awesome. Even here under his neck, not seeing a whole lot of noise, and that's what we really want to see in an image. We want to see detail with very little noise. In this image, again, we're seeing high dynamic range. We see shadows over here. We see details in the shadows. There's a little bit more noise, I think, in some of this than the previous image. If I zoom in here and look specifically like in this area, I can see more noise than the prior image. But in terms of complaining about it, nobody's going to complain about that. This is a very nice image. We have very wide tonal range. We have lots of darks. We have lots of shadow, and then we have lots of brightness. I don't know where this really bright light is coming from on her back and her arm. I don't know that they used flash. Maybe they had somebody with a reflector behind her to highlight her hair. The sun is obviously up here, and he's got some rooster fingers going on there. It kind of looks kind of weird, but that's not the camera. That's just the moment of the photo. The last image that we're going to look at before we talk about problem areas, and that's going to be a separate video. So we'll talk about that in a separate video. This is a very hard lighting situation. If you note the fact that the sun is right behind this bell tower, the sun is really bright right in this area. This is a tough image to grab because you have this really bright sky, clouds, blue sky, sun right behind, and yet we see plenty of detail. We see this bell. We can actually see into the bell itself. If you're looking right in here, you can see on this edge of the bell there's a little bit of detail. Not a whole lot. It's not like there's a light underneath that thing, but there's more detail than you would get in most cameras. The entire area of this building is lit. Now, again, I don't know, maybe there was some other building right across the street reflecting light, which brought in lots of light. I don't know. I can't wait to do a side-by-side comparison where I take an image with the smartphone, an image with the light L16, and a DSLR. That's where we're really going to find out how well things work or don't work, is when we have something that we can compare a known thing to a new thing. So when we get the opportunity to do that, I hope you come back to lightRumors, because that's going to be really awesome. But there's some amazing detail in this. And again, this is probably shot at something like an f8 or an f16, because there's not a whole lot of depth of field here. Or there's not a narrow depth of field. Just about everything is in focus, including maybe way back to the sky. So maybe this was like an f16, kind of an aperture. And if we look at even things like here, we were looking for chromatic aberration earlier, and we're not seeing any of that in here, but yet we're still seeing color. It's not a silhouette. It's not just really dark because the sun was on the other side. This, on first glance, is not maybe the most appealing image, but if you think about what's going on here, if you think about what the L16 is actually capturing and being able to provide detail not only in the front of the image, in the shadow areas, but detail in the sky and the clouds, this is pretty amazing. Really amazing. I'm pretty impressed by this image. And I think that's why they have put it on their website, because it's very impressive. Let's play with it for just a few seconds. I don't know, let's throw my Color Miracle on it. We get a lot more detail. We can fool with the blacks and bring down the blacks a little bit. Let's bring down the luminance in the blues. Let's put the blacks back up. It's too dark. I mean, look at the detail in the clouds. We're not seeing a whole lot of fringing on this. We can do all kinds of stuff to this image, but we've got all kinds of detail. Look at the fine detail in these clouds over here that we've just pulled out by bringing down the blues. That's astounding. And yet we still have detail in the brick. You can see all the little pock marks you can see underneath here, which would normally be very, very dark. So that's a not so quick look at a few of the images from the Light L16. I would love for you to tune in to the next video where I'm going to talk about some of the problem areas. There are some problems with the images that we have received. Again, we don't have the full image to really dive deeply, but I do want to highlight some of those problem areas for you to be looking for in your own images. Maybe they'll get them fixed before production release. The good news is, of course, that Light is able to fine-tune their software and deliver new software to you. So that will be encouraging. So even if you find some problems, and there aren't that many, but tune into the next video and you will see some of those problems. Thank you for watching. This is Planet Mitch from lightrumors.co.